Ladies and gentlemen, it's Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran, and today we are taking a look at maybe one of the biggest shifts in the Ukraine war. This is the movement of the war in the East and Russia's growing offensive success. And we are going to be breaking down what tactical change Russia has done to ensure that they're able to actually make some real offensive gains and why they probably should have been doing it from day one. Let's get into it.
It's now 3 months since Russia invaded Ukraine, a fight it expected to win easily, now becoming a protracted, grinding war. Although Russian forces are making progress, it's slow, confined to small objectives, not the big sweeping victories the Kremlin intended.
So this is sort of what I've been talking about for a long time. If you remember one of my previous videos, I talked about the three options available to Russia to win the war, right? And that basically, or to conclude the war, and that the most likely was that they would shift all of their forces into the east. We talked because that is where they are most likely to have, if not overwhelming popular support, where at least a contingent of the population would support Russian military efforts due to the large number of Russian speakers there and Russia's protracted campaigns about building loyalty among the civilian population in the eastern part of Ukraine. It also would allow Russia to focus its combat power, which had clearly been spread far too thin in its three-pronged initial invasion of Ukraine.
The main focus of the battle is here in the far east of Ukraine, in Luhansk, around the city of Severodonetsk. Russian forces are slowly pushing in from the north and south, creating a pinch point, raising the possibility Ukrainian forces will be cut off, surrounded in a so-called Cauldron, a favourite Soviet tactic dating back to Stalingrad. But
yes, this is a reference. Well, he's right. Stalingrad is one of the earliest examples of the Red Army at the time, modern Russian army, using a cauldron-style encirclement. This is the idea. Of course, they certainly didn't invent it, right? Encirclement and flanking dates back to at least Alexander the Great that we have good sources of. But it simply means that you've enveloped the enemy and that they have no options to retreat. In that situation, it becomes hugely tactically advantageous because you are able to slowly grind down the enemy. They very quickly burn out, running out of ammunition, food, and other essential supplies, right, without access to the rest of their forces. The hard part about the Cauldron is that it's like a bubble. It's very easy to pop, and you have to fight inside the bubble, but you also have to keep anything from popping the bubble. So it can be really tough to do, but if it can be done successfully, it can be it can have a devastating effect on the encircled army. So classically, right, Russia would struggle to do this at scale, as we've talked about. Their logistics simply can't seem to handle large-scale maneuver like they've attempted to. But at a smaller scale, they may be able to successfully encircle smaller pockets of Ukrainian forces.
But analysts believe the Russians are now focusing on cutting off pockets of Ukrainian troops rather than one big encirclement, and focus instead on Severodonetsk. Meanwhile, in the south, Ukrainian forces are said to have launched a counteroffensive around the city of Mykolaiv, not far from Kherson.
The big moves.
So this is interesting because it reflects, of course, probably different strategic priorities. Now, what is the advantages here? Well, so Ukrainians know one of their tremendous advantages is logistical. And that means that they have, because of support from the EU, but also because they have a largely pacified backfield, so to speak, right? If you're off the front lines, civilians are helpful. They want the militaries to succeed. They are supportive of the military's efforts. And it means that they can easily resupply troops on the front lines. In contrast, Russia has struggled immensely with its logistics. But key to Russia's continued logistical success is, of course, the existence of ports and rails. So if you can cut off key port areas like Kherson, like these other large warm water ports in the Black Sea, you're going to be much more likely to damage Russian logistical efforts. And if there's one thing that the Ukrainian armed forces is prepared for, it's a long, grinding, attritional fight, since that's what they've been in since 2014.
Nikolaev, not far from Kherson.
The big moves are failing. The big move failed in Kiev. It failed on the other side of Kiev. It failed around Kharkiv. And now what they're looking at is just bombarding everything to rubble with artillery and then moving forward quickly afterwards.
So this is really important because we've talked about in other videos. This was the tactic that Russia... So we are almost play by play the first and second Chechen wars. And what I mean by that is in the early 90s, the Russian military had to put down what was calling itself the Republic of Chechnya. And this was a Russian republic that declared itself independent. And Russia just could not abide this. It had already had many other states and provinces declare themselves independent countries. It refused to recognize Chechnya and sent in its military to seize Chechnya's capital city of Grozny. Initially, Russia tried just what it tried here, using its powerful tanks and armor in a spectacular blitz-style attack, pushing hard into the center of Grozny. And they were met with an extremely well-trained guerrilla forces, many of whom were Soviet Afghan veterans who had seen how to fight Soviet armor from the other side as Soviet tankers. And so they were extremely prepared to deal with these Soviet armored columns. They successfully cut them off. They pulled them deep into the city, used anti-armor weapons, took advantage of Soviets' weak infantry support, and tore the Russian army to pieces. The Russian army had pushed in too hard, got torn up. We've seen probably dozens of videos of exactly that happening now. Apparently the Russian military didn't learn a lot of lessons. But in contrast, when the Russians did win the battle of the war, or the Chechen War, but they did so when they switched tactics. They encircled the city and block by block leveled it with artillery and advanced slowly, methodically, and systematically through the city. There was still a lot of war, but the gains were taken one slice at a time. It was slower, it was brutal, it left very, very little infrastructure intact. It inherently meant destroying huge parts of civilian areas, but it was effective. It allowed the Russian military to eventually reach all the way to the heart of Grozny, seize the palace, and coerce a surrender of the Chechen forces, or at least declare itself the winner.
And then bombard again, and then move forward again. So taking things in bombard-shaped sizes is much more successful for them than trying what are now appearing, what we now can see, were extremely risky infantry movements, because they're infantry, they're garbage.
This is especially from a British commentator, who the British tend to be, in my experience, a little more discerning, a little less prone to bombastic statements. So to call them garbage must mean that they are frighteningly incompetent.
I mean, they really are. They're not infantry. They're just blokes with rifles. And so if you're sending blokes with rifles, you've got to use something first to kill the ground. Otherwise, they just get eaten alive by regular Ukrainians.
And he doesn't mean regular Ukrainians. He means Ukrainian regulars. Regulars meaning standard infantry troops, right? Properly trained, properly integrated, properly equipped regular army troops, not militia, not irregulars like police forces, but regular army troops.
Russian forces have responded by forming reserves and deploying S-400 missile systems in northern Crimea to bolster this southern axis.
So this is, again, what we're talking about. We're seeing Russia pivoting towards a very, very classic strategy that's served them well since at least the 90s, which is bomb and advance. This is something that was honestly used to effect in World War I, where infantry would have to learn to coordinate with artillery, and that as artillery would clear an area, infantry would advance directly behind the artillery screen. That requires, for World War I, it was a lot of finesse and communication. It required regular use of radio, transmitting positions, and moving artillery, because you never want your infantry to walk into your artillery, and you never want the artillery shield to lift, exposing the infantry to the enemy. But in modern warfare, a modern mechanized high-tech military can easily do that level of communication. That what was a highly advanced division level communication problem in World War I is now something that you would expect an infantry squad to do, or an infantry platoon to do on the modern battlefield, communicating with aircraft or artillery, providing their position, the position of the enemy, and coordinating the fires. But if you're Russia, as he discussed, this is a country with extremely poorly trained, extremely poorly led infantry, but even that level of coordination is too sophisticated. And so instead, they have to rely on a reliable, trusted World War I style tactic, which again, if it works, it's not outdated. Now, obviously, you're winning, but you're winning control of a destroyed town, but sometimes a win is a win.
Ukrainian troops are also counterattacking in the north around Kharkiv, close to the Russian border. Reports suggest the Kremlin may be forced to send elements of its first tank army to the city to try and reinforce Russian lines. Many of the artillery pieces donated by the West are now reaching Ukrainian forces, including most of the 90 M777 howitzers supplied by the US, although Moscow claims it's already destroyed one of them.
You have to remember is that even with all the American equipment, it's still not much.
Right. You have to remember too that this has primarily become, or not primarily, but increasingly become an artillery-driven conflict, right? These are lines locked in and on both sides, because as we've discussed in other videos, if you are going to use artillery as your primary weapon, your biggest fear is counter battery fire. That is, if your enemy's artillery can do the math on your incoming rounds and can reverse the direction, figure out where they came from, because if you know the trajectory that they came in on, then you can work it back to find their point of origin and quickly throw rounds back at the enemy. This is the best bet probably for the Ukrainians to stop the Russian artillery-heavy advanced offensive tactics. But they need their own artillery pieces intact. They need to get them set in position and returning rounds as fast as possible. It's a tough challenge, and it's a big challenge that is very different, you saw, from fighting a big armored column trying to push to your capital city, right? Doing that fight involves anti-armor weapons. It involves small tank killer teams. It involves very carefully selecting ambush sites, right? It involves space for time. And this is a very, very different war. Now, in some ways, it's good because the Ukrainians have fought a war very much like this since 2014 against the separatists. But it's also very different because they have not won that war since 2014 against the separatists.
All right, we're not talking about people getting lots and lots of guns. When you spread those guns around, again, when you spread something over the size of Great Britain, which is really what we're looking at, then there's big spaces between them. I mean, but the good thing is that the Ukrainians have improved the technical use of gunnery. I'm going to say much beyond the West. The Western countries, and so they're getting to be much more precision based.
Yeah, this has been fascinating to see the Ukrainians' military's ability to coordinate the use of their guns. When we say guns, of course, this will help you sound smart when talking to military people. Guns refer to, in military parlance, to artillery pieces, big indirect fire weapons. You would say like your individual weapon, your individual firearm, or you would just call a weapon its identifier. You'd say, hey, or small arms fire is like a catch-all for an individually operated, individually portable weapon. So again, M4s, M16s, AK-47s, AK-74s, you would either identify them by name, refer to them in general as small arms fire, or like an individual weapon. But a gun refers to what you're seeing on the screen here. Now, what's fascinating is the Ukrainians' ability to use their guns and coordinate the fires using drone technology. That's not really something that we in the West have thought about. We've never thought about integrating those with drones because we think of our drones as being high-flying aircraft substitutes, unmanned aircraft. But Ukrainians don't have access to Predator drones, Shadows, or other big aircraft-sized drones. Instead, all they have are the commercial off-the-shelf drone tech. But those are so effective at guiding an artillery because they become a stable observer point. You've turned your observer, instead of being a human being calculating trajectories, you have a drone do it. Zero risk to your armed forces and just as effective, if not more so, because of the elevated position they can view from.
With the weapons and much more connected.
Plus, as other commenters have talked about, the Ukrainians also have their Uber for Fire missions, where a single fire direction center receives all the missions and automatically finds the best positioned available gun to serve that fire mission. And it's a great system that, again, is a beautiful blend of old school warfare, which is indirect fire, and new school app-driven, software-driven mission assignments.
Than we've managed to be. And so I think that, when they get these guns, they will start eating away at the Russians. The problem is there's just so many Russians.
Russian forces in Mariupol say they plan to try Ukrainian troops they captured in the Azovstal steelworks for war crimes, a move seen as retaliation for the Russian tank commander sentenced to life earlier this week for shooting dead a Ukrainian civilian. Elsewhere, Russian forces are continuing their efforts to encircle Severodonetsk as they prepare for what's anticipated to be a grueling urban battle. Simon Newton, Forces News.
Yep, this is a very, very interesting potential change to the warfare that we've seen up until this point. Again, tank warfare probably phasing out, and we're returning to the era of the slow plodding artillery battle. Now, guys, if you've stuck with me for this long, right, you may know that I get a lot of questions about YouTube. You get a lot of questions about thumbnails, editing, how to find topics that are going to get views. And I've taken everything I know and distilled it down into a single YouTube course. Check the link in the description, right? I tried to price it a lot cheaper than every other YouTuber's course. So definitely do me a favor, check it out. It's like 5 hours of lectures. Plus there's a money back guarantee. If you don't earn back course tuition after 6 months, I'll refund it. So there's no risk to you. Okay. Also, if you want to access some exclusive content, including some of the stuff that's just a little too spicy for YouTube, check out the Patreon. Thanks to my Lieutenant tier patrons. I'll see you in the next one.